Can I welcome all of you to Trinity College. My name is Father Michael Kerwin, Jesuit priest. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But the first few little practicalities, should anything require emergency evacuation, you'll see the doors being marked at the back there. I think those are the doors to go for, where it says the green exit signs. So please, if we do need to vacate, do so in an orderly, non-panicky fashion. If anybody's looking for toilets at any stage, I think you'd need to go back towards the main entrance and then downstairs. So they're a little bit, they're not exactly handy, but they're that direction should you need the toilets. And then the usual thing, do please switch off mobile phones. You might be a bit like me, I can't even switch mine on. But if you know how to switch yours off, could you make sure that it is? Thank you very much indeed. You're very welcome this evening to this presentation, jointly sponsored by the Loyola Institute and the Irish branch of the Carmelites. And it's a terrific occasion, and you can see that the numbers have turned up for it, so it's really good that you're all here. What is the Loyola Institute? It is an institute of theology within Trinity College, within the School of Religion, Theology and Peace Studies here in Trinity. You could say it's a very ecumenical venture because it brings together the synergies from, and I've got them so I don't miss anybody out, the Carmelites, the Columbans, the Jesuits, Loretto Sisters, the Marists, the Oblates, and the Society of African Missions. Those are the congregations that have contributed their energies and their inspiration to the work of Loyola. And tonight's a very special expression of that synergies as we welcome our Carmelite brothers and sisters to celebrate one of their own, an extraordinary man, Titus Brandsma, an order of importance, an academic administrator, but also a mystic and theologian, journalist, and a martyr. And we'll be hearing more about him and celebrating his life. But I just want to draw attention to my own personal gratitude for the depth of spirituality that we have from the Carmelites, and which the Jesuits at their best also share. And in terms of celebrating our martyrs, I did some research on martyrdom a number of years ago, and somebody informed me of a wonderful definition from a school child who said, a martyr is someone who dies on purpose. Someone who dies on purpose. I would add that the martyrs are men and women who can help us to walk that little bit taller as Jesuits, as Carmelites, as Christians, because we see presented to us the ideal that we are trying to live out, and in particular the testimony that comes from the abyss, from the place of no God, where God is denied by the cruelty, the inhumanity, and the prejudice of those who have been persecuting us. And the Carmelites, the Carmelite genius understands that, and the Jesuit genius understands that. And whether we're talking about the cell in Toledo, where St. John wrote down his mystical visions, whether we're talking about today's Jesuit feast, Claude de la Colombière, who's great promoter of the Sacred Heart devotion, proclamation of God's love, even though he spent a number of years in a London prison. And then the subject of this evening's talk, Titus Brandsma, how to testify to God in and from the abyss. There's a story which I think someone's going to have to tell me whether it's a true story or not, of Teresa of Avila writing to one of her convents, giving them advice as to how to deal with their Jesuit spiritual director. And the story goes, you have to tell me it's true, and apparently she writes to them, says, make sure you ask him lots of questions. They like that. We Jesuits, we do love to have the last word. Well, tonight, we're not going to get it, and I'm handing over now to Michael Troy, the provincial of the Irish Carmelites, to initiate the proceedings and also introduce our main speaker. Thank you very much, and you're very, very welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your warm welcome. And on behalf of the Irish province of Carmelites, I welcome you all here tonight to Loyola and Trinity College. In May 2022, the Dutch Carmelite friar Titus Brandsma was canonised and proclaimed a saint. And this wonderful event was an occasion of great joy and celebration and indeed blessing for the Carmelite family and for the wider European family. Titus Brandsma, this dangerous little friar, had spoken out boldly for freedom during tyranny, freedom of individual conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And in a world where human and Christian freedom and values are still denied to many, the message of St. Titus is one of hope, one of forgiveness, and one of reconciliation. As part of our work in the Irish province to make his life, message, and courage known to many, we are delighted to be associated with the Loyola Institute, Trinity College, Dublin, to host this lecture here this evening. Titus Brandsma, Ethical Resistance in Turbulent Times. I think you can all agree that the topic is very relevant for the times we are living in at the moment. It's my very pleasant duty to welcome on behalf of us all Fernando Millán Romeral. Fernando was born in Madrid and, like his father, his brother and his nephew, was educated in the Carmelite school, St. Mary of Carmel, Los Misterios in Madrid. Having entered the Bética province of the order in 1981, he went on to do his studies in Madrid, but also 1 year of studies here in the Milltown Institute, before going on eventually to defend his doctoral thesis in Rome on the sacrament of reconciliation. It was based on the work of the Carmelite Bartolomeo Ziberta, whose theses touched on reconciliation with God and with the Church. Father Fernando taught sacramental theology at the Pontifical Universities of Camillus, Madrid, and the Gregorian in Rome. So he's well associated with Jesuits and their ways and means. Fernando was elected to serve as Prior General of the Order in 2007, a role he fulfilled with distinction for 12 years, putting his time of service to the whole order under the patronage of Titus Brandsma and Bartolomeo Ziberta. And during that time, he continued his lectures worldwide. Presently, he has returned to Camillus University in Madrid as director of its Institute of Spirituality and Systematics. He's the author of a number of books and articles, and he co-edits a collection of books entitled Texts for the Millennium. They are seeking to recover significant texts from the Carmelite tradition. He has a huge interest in contemporary literature, Spanish culture, and Jewish-Christian relations, and not forgetting his passionate support for Real Madrid. Now, you have to remember it's Real Madrid. but they are 9 points behind when I last looked at the table. We as Carmelites know him very well in Ireland, but we have known him as a person of great humanity, and in the spirit of the Scriptures, a person who constantly encourages his brothers and sisters. And finally, following on from a personal interest at the time of Titus' beatification, now Saint Titus, Fernando has dedicated his energy and scholarship in promoting the contemporary figure of Titus Brandsma, a figure of holiness, a figure of truth and reconciliation, one who could pray in the midst of the horror and degradation of that time, God bless Holland, God bless Germany. Fernando, you are most welcome, and thank you for your presence among us this evening. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. And first of all, I want to thank Michael and Foncha for the invitation to participate in this program and to be here this evening. It's always a pleasure to come to Dublin and to meet so many good friends and people. So thank you very much for this invitation. And thank you to all of you for coming here this evening to listen a little bit about Titus Brandsma. Let me say at the beginning that perhaps for some of you it may be a little bit strange or even disappointing, because we are not going to talk about the spiritual journey of Titus Brandsma or the mysticism or the Carmelite dimension, but the topic of this evening is his conflict with the National Socialist philosophy and understanding of life and human beings. This is the topic. So if anybody of you after 15 minutes think he's talking about other fellow, no, it's the very same man. But Titus was, as you say in English, multifaceted person. He was journalist, he was professor in the university, he was an expert on mysticism, and there are many biographies of Titus Brandsma. It has been very fashionable in the last decades when someone wrote a biography of an important person, Barack Obama or Cristiano Ronaldo or whatever, to say Barack Obama, a biography. It's a way of saying it's one of the possible biographies. There is not only one, a canonical one. In the case of Titus, this is absolutely true, because he had so many dimensions in his life. He had so many points of interest, enthusiasm, and so on, that it's very difficult to build up just a biography. So we are going to take this dimension and we are going to focus on this political conflict with National Socialism. I'm going to divide this talk in two parts. The first one will be a presentation of the life of Titus. I suppose most of you have heard it several times and know it very well, but perhaps for some of you could be good to know a little bit more about the life of Titus Brandsma. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about 6 moments of special intensity in the conflict with the Nazis authorities in Holland, in the Netherlands. So I have chosen 6 moments just to show how he was in conflict with this perverse ideology, and to know the attitude of Titus regarding this National Socialism. And I hope that I will be able to say all the terms in English, because these political terms are not so easy for me. I think I will be understandable enough. I hope I ask you your patience. So let's start with the biography of Titus Brandsma. Titus Brandsma was a Carmelite who was born in Bolsward, in Friesland, in the northest part of the Netherlands. He belonged to a very Catholic family in a very Protestant ambience. In Friesland, in those years, Catholicism was around 3% of the population. But there were some places, and Bolsward was one of those, in which there was a sort of Catholic population, quite identitarian, with a strong identity. And Titus belonged to a very Catholic family. 5 out of 6 siblings became religious. 3 nuns, his brother who was a Franciscan, Henry, and himself who was a Carmelite. So 5 out of 6 became religious. It says a lot about the religiosity of the family. The spirituality of the family was Franciscan, because the Franciscans were in charge of the Catholic population there, and the parents were third-order Franciscans, and 2 of the sisters became Franciscans, and the brother became Franciscan, so they were very much in the Franciscan spirituality. Titus, whose name before religious life was Anno Soert, Titus was a very weak boy, very fragile, and very keen on books, and very pious. So the parents thought he was going to be religious, and they sent him to Megen, to the secondary school of the Franciscans, in which they could study, and at the same time the boys could reflect and discern about their possible vocation. Everybody thought that Titus was going to be Franciscan, but he became a Carmelite. And the reason was that he had a long conversation with his mother's cousin, Casimir de Boer, who was a Carmelite, and he spoke to him about Mount Carmel and all the golden legends of Carmel and so on, and he fell in love with the Carmelite tradition and the Carmelite spirituality. He went to study philosophy and theology, and in 1905 he was ordained priest in Hertogenbosch, in the wonderful cathedral of Hertogenbosch. Let me tell you a little anecdote that usually in the biographies is not very important, but I think for our topic may be very important and very significant, is that when he finished, the other students, the other friars were sent to different convents and parishes and so on, but Titus was punished, and he stayed 1 more year in the student house. And the reason for that punishment, inverted commas, was that he was very free about some ideas, about philosophy, and he was very independent in his way of thinking philosophically, not about concrete and modern questions, but about ente et essentia in the Middle Ages and some metaphysical controversies and so on. But it's very significant because he was very free from the beginning. He was very honest with himself. He was able to defend what he believed, very, very clear in his mind and so on. He was punished to be assistant of the sacristy, not even sacristan, but assistant of the sacristy. So I suppose his job was to put the water and the wine in the crute or something like that, no more than that, you know. After that year, he was sent to Rome to do his doctorate in philosophy. And meanwhile, he was in Rome. He got in contact with these circles of social Catholicism in Italy, you know, the possibility of having Catholic trade unions and Catholic political parties, and to get closer to the workers and so on. So in Rome, he also got in contact with this sensibility about modern world and dialogue with some groups of the population that were getting too far from the church. When he did his doctorate in 1909, he went back to Holland, and he started a frenetic activity in many fields, in many realms. I'm going just to mention some of them, and you can imagine the amount of work and activity that Titus Brandsma developed during many years. First of all, in the world of education, Titus was an enthusiastic man about Carmelite education and Catholic education. He was a founder of schools, he was teacher himself in the school, and he was a pioneer about Carmelite schools. In 1909, in those years at the beginning of the 20th century, Carmelite schools were not very common. The very first one we had was Trinity College here in Dublin in 1860, I think. And the second one was Mount Carmel High School in Chicago. Some provinces were open to have schools, but several provinces in the order were very reluctant to have schools. You know, this is not our charism. What are we doing in education? We are not teachers. We are not Salesians or Claretians or whatever. And still today, some provinces have no schools at all, and it's a strange apostolate for them. So Titus was very strong, moving ahead the Dutch province to open schools and to get in contact with youth and so on. It was very strange also in Holland, because an officially Protestant country, it was not so easy to get the rights for the Catholic schools with the same status of other schools in the country. So he was enthusiastic of education. He reflected on education. He wrote on education and modern pedagogic and so on. And this was the first field in which he was very involved and very generous. That work in education finished, or almost finished, in 1923. Because that year was opened the Catholic University in Nijmegen. It was a dream for the Catholic Church. After the restoration of the bishops and the parishes and all that, the Catholic University was the crown of that process. And Titus was invited to be professor there, and he was teaching history of mysticism, let us say history of spirituality, and philosophy. He was teaching till the very last year of his life in this University of Nijmegen. Another field in which he was very active was journalism. He was a vocational journalist, and he was a professional journalist. He was the editor of a journal, of a newspaper in the city of Oz, and he wrote hundreds of little articles about spirituality, about the political situation, about many, many topics. So he was not a sort of a professor just living in the ivory tower, you know, studying only my topic. He was very generous with his time, writing divulgation articles of spirituality and so on. In 1935, he visited the United States and Canada, and he was giving some talks there about Carmelite spirituality. And when he came back to Europe, he was very surprised about the level of the Catholic journalism in the States. I think, I'm not able to demonstrate it, but I think that he got in contact with Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, all that world, and he wanted to open a chair of journalism in the University of Nijmegen, but it was not possible. He didn't succeed. Probably because they thought it's too much, you know, a chair of journalism, what are we going to say in such a chair, you know? Imagine now in all the universities around the world there is a program of journalism, but in those times it was not so clear. As I said about education, also in journalism and communication, he was not just working in that field, but he was reflecting. He wrote about journalism, about the role of the church in journalism, about the style of the Catholic newspapers, you know, serving the truth, but serving the truth in a peaceful and respectful way, and so on. And he has some nice articles about the attitude of the church regarding mass media. I used to say that he was a pioneer of the Second Vatican Council in this field, in the field of communication. And that's why in that year, 1935, he was appointed as religious assistant of the Dutch bishops for the Catholic press. So he was in charge, he was the liaison between the bishops and the Catholic journalists and so on. The third field in which he worked very much was ecumenism. He was also a pioneer, especially in Carmel, he was a pioneer of ecumenism. He belonged to the so-called Association for the Reunification with the Eastern Churches. It was an association in Holland that pretended to know better the Eastern Churches, both united and not united to Rome, to pray for each other, to know the Eastern spirituality, and so on. And he was very enthusiastic about it. But he was also very, let us say, elegant, very delicate in the everyday life with the Protestants. You know, he was very fraternal, let us say it that way, you know. For instance, just to give you an example, in 1931, we were all celebrating the 15th centenary of the Congress of the Council of Ephesus, in which Mary was named as Theotokos, the Mother of God, the God-bearer. And they decided to organize a congress and to give some talks and so on. And Titus had the wonderful and strange idea to organize a procession, a Marian procession. So in the 30s in Nijmegen, to have a Marian procession was not the most common experience. Few days before, he published an article in the newspapers explaining to our Protestant brethren the sense of our devotion to Mary in a very gentle way, you know, saying we are not trying to make a sort of demonstration or exhibition or, you know, provocation or whatever. For us, Mary is a good way to go to the very heart of the gospel, and he was explaining in a very nice way. Usually when I speak about this, there is always someone who says, why did he have to apologize for that? We Catholic, we have to apologize always for everything and so on. Well, remember Lumen Gentium, I think is number 58. It says something very similar to the preachers. When you preach about Mary, take care not to be exaggerated and to provoke a scandal to other Christians, so that our preaching about Mary has to be sound and biblical and well-based theologically and so on. So in a way, Titus anticipated that sentence of the Second Vatican Council. And this gentleness with our Protestant brethren was, let us say, rewarded in the process of beatification, because many Protestants declared in the process of beatification, especially pastors he knew in the concentration camp. You know that the concentration camps were wonderful, understand the sentence, it was a wonderful place for ecumenism. The ecumenism went ahead in the concentration camps, not only for fraternity, for solidarity and so on, but as Jean Guiton said, because we Christians, Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, Orthodox, Anglicans, we were able to proclaim there in the kingdom of evil, we were able to proclaim Jesus is the Lord. Jesus is the Lord. And that's the real ecumenism, you know. In this horrendous place, and the Lord is not the crematorium, is not the SS, is not Hitler, Jesus Christ is the Lord. And we shared the most wonderful and the most important truth of our faith in those terrible places. And some Protestants were very nice in the beatification process. Just to let you know one of the witnesses, he receives a letter from the vice postulator, Father Adrian Staring, and he answers saying, well, dear Father Staring, thank you very much for your invitation. As you know, I am a Reformed Christian, so I don't believe in these beatifications and canonizations. Nevertheless, I can only tell you that I knew that man, and I think that man was touched by the grace of God. And I hope to be worthy to be with him in heaven. Wonderful witness. That man was touched by the grace of God, and I hope to be worthy to be with him in heaven. Okay, ecumenism is another field. Another one is Esperanto. I suppose all of you know this artificial language. I have to be very careful because in 2 talks I have been talking about Esperanto, and there were some Esperantists in the audience, so I have to be very careful what I say. Let us say this artificial language was not so successful as it was supposed, you know. It was a wonderful idea. This Ludwig Zamenhof, the creator of Esperanto, wanted to create a language that unites everybody, you know. It's so sad that many times languages separate people, you know. And he was, this Ludwig Zamenhof, the creator of Esperanto, was living in what more or less today is, how do you say in English, Belarus. So language there was a very sensitive topic, you know. If you spoke Polish, this is a Catholic, Roman Catholic, if you spoke Russian, if you spoke German, if you spoke Yiddish, the language of the European Jews and so on. So this Zamenhof said, let us create a new language, you know, that is not, there is no colonialism. In those years, French was the international language. Now English is the international language, you know, but some people is a bit reluctant, you know, to speak others' language. So let us create a language that is nobody's and is everybody's, and that would be Esperanto. And Titus was very keen on Esperanto. He participated in several congresses, and it says a lot also of his attitude, you know, Esperanto, to make people understand each other, you know, and that's wonderful. Esperanto succeeded only in 2 worlds. One was the international anarchism. Anarchists were very keen on Esperanto, no borders, no nations, we are one humanity, one. And also in the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, Radio Vaticana has still a program in Esperanto every 15 days. So in the Catholic Church, several priests were keen on Esperanto. And Titus Brandsma and Father Kolbe are considered the patron saints of Esperanto. So he was very involved in that. Only 2 more fields, and I finish this because it's an amazing life. He was also very active in divulgating the Frisian language and the Frisian culture. You know that Friesland is, they have a very strong identity within the Netherlands. They have their own language that is not a dialect, it's another language. And there's a sort of, let us say that way, strong identity within the Netherlands. And Titus was very enthusiastic about that, to create a chair of Frisian culture, to publish books in Frisian, to preach in Frisian. He was also very active in that. And the last field I am going to mention is the work of spirituality. He was also a scholar, teaching spirituality. He was researching, especially in 2 fields. The first one was the Dutch spiritual literature of the Middle Ages, especially Devotio Moderna and all that. He participated in the so-called Bibliotheca Neerlandica Pre-Reformatoria, so in the library of Dutch medieval texts before the Reformation. And of course, in publishing and translating the works of Saint Teresa of Avila. He was a fan of Teresa, he was in love with Teresa, and he wanted to have Teresa translated into Dutch, because there was an old translation of the 16th, at the beginning of the 17th century, but it was in old Dutch and with a lot of lacks and mistakes and so on. So he wanted to have the works of Teresa translated into Dutch. And they were able to publish 4 volumes, and that was one of the biggest frustrations of Titus Brandsma in his life, that he was not able to finish the publication of the works of Teresa. All that activity changed, and all his life changed, the 10th of May 1940, because that day the German army invaded Holland in few days, or in some hours, we could say. It was a good example of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. In very short time, they invaded the whole country. After the bombing of Rotterdam, the Dutch army surrendered, and the Queen fled from Holland. She was in England for some years, and Holland became a part of the Third Reich. At the very beginning, the German authorities seemed to be very respectful of the autonomy of Holland. Seemed to be, for several reasons. Holland was, let us say, an educated people, was a rather wealthy country, and we are the same race. They are Aryan as we are, so we cannot treat them like Jewish or Mediterranean or slaves or whatever, Slavic, or they are Aryan, blondie hair and tall and so on. So they were, at the beginning, for instance, the commissar of the Reich was not a German, was an Austrian, say Sinquart. So it was a sign of saying, we are not invading you, but we are forming the new Reich and the new German Empire all together and so on. But little by little that situation changed, and they were pressing the population, especially the Jewish population. Holland was one of the countries in which the Jewish population suffered more. Thousands and thousands of Jews were taken to the extermination camps in the West and so on, in the East and so on. And from that date, Titus got in conflict with the authorities, and he was arrested the 19th January 1942, the day before the Wannsee conference, in which the Nazis authority decided the Endlösung, the final solution to the Jewish problem. So one day before, Titus was arrested in Nijmegen, and he went to different jails and different concentration camps and so on, and he died the 26th July 1942. That could be the life of our man. Let us now take a look of some moments of conflict with the National Socialist world, let us say that way. Many people think that the conflict started after the invasion of Holland, but it's not true. The conflict and the confrontation started much before. I would say the first moment could be a conference he gave in Deventer in 1932, so some months before Hitler won the elections and got in power. So even before Hitler was in power, Titus was already, let us say, questioning this mentality of National Socialism. He gave a talk, a conference with the title, Peace and Love for Peace. That was the title. And the audience of the conference was very diverse, Jewish, Protestants, Catholics, so it was a diverse audience. And Titus was speaking in a very humble way. He was not teaching, he was sharing with the audience. We could summarize his conference in 3 points. The first one is, peace is possible. Peace is not only a short period between two wars. Peace is possible. We have to change our pessimism, our defeatism, and we have to work enthusiastically for peace. We have to change the mentality of the classical proverb, si vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare yourself for the war. The best way of working for peace is to grow and to be strong. So we have to change that mentality. The second idea is international agreements, international deals are very important. What diplomats are doing, what politicians are doing is very important for peace, but it's not enough. It's good, but it's not enough, because we have to change our mentality, we have to change our hearts, we have to change our approach to reality. There is a personal selfishness, but there is also a national selfishness. If every country is only fighting for itself, and we are fighting for our borders, for our industry, for our markets, for our money, and we don't open our horizons, there will be always wars. let me tell you, when I was reading this of Titus, this is a personal confession, I remembered when Spain, my own country, joined in the European community, and we participated in the first elections, for us, the first elections in Europe. I remember the slogans were so nice. Let us build Europe together. Let us build a Europe of solidarity and humanity and so on, you know, and nice slogans. In the last elections, the slogans were so ugly. Let us defend our rights in Brussels. Let us go there to get our money. Let us fight for our rights, you know. So that's the mentality Titus was criticizing, this national selfishness. Instead of looking all together, of course there will be always problems and there will be always delicate situations and so on, but if we are just looking for our own good, wars will be always there, you know. I don't want to put examples of any politician, but if you hear some of the mottos of some politicians in our times, it remains very much that mentality. And the third idea was to offer the example of Christ. And the audience was not Catholic, was not only Catholic, was not only Christian, and so he did it in a very soft and a very gentle way. He said, probably Christ is not the same for all of you. We have a different idea of Christ's message and so on. But we can all agree that the Easter message of Christ, we can share that. My peace I give you, my peace I leave you. And we can share that commitment that Jesus gave us, all of us. It's very interesting, this conference, because when he finished, he wanted to join into the Comité de Vigilance des Intellectuels Antifascistes, the French committee of anti-fascist intellectuals. But at the end he didn't join because the Dutch bishop didn't allow any Catholic priest to join in movements in which there were communists or fascists. And there were many communists in that committee, and so he couldn't join that. But his idea was to join in that committee. And another interesting thing about this conference is that he was questioning, in a way, the so-called reparations that Germany had to pay after the First World War. You remember John Maynard Keynes, who was also questioning those reparations. Keynes thought if they are going to develop an incredible industry and aggressive economy and so on. So Titus was also questioning from the, let us say, the moral point of view, not so much from the economics point of view, but from the moral point of view. Let me just read you a paragraph. A lack of forgiveness is deeply connected with the lack of love. Of course, one cannot be expected to take everything, but does that mean we have to go back to the old pagan ideas that every indignity has to be washed away with blood? Are we saying that forgiveness is a sign of weakness? It is very sad that in international political life, a mistake can never be forgiven. Aversion and even hatred are artificially fostered between countries and their peoples, and a good word about a former enemy or a positive perspective on him is almost considered to be less majesty and treason against the state. So he was questioning the policy of the 20s and the 30s regarding Germany and so on. So that would be the first moment, 1932, this conference in Deventer. Second moment, 1935. You remember in 1935, in September, were published the so-called Nuremberg laws. And that's a milestone in the history of Nazism and in the history of anti-Semitism and Holocaust and so on. It was a perverse legislation, a perverse taxonomy, trying to explain who was Jewish, who was not, if one of your grandparents was Jewish, or 2 or 3 or 4, you were cataloged in a category, and it was probably, have you seen the tables, you know, with all the possibilities and sort of a diabolic taxonomy of human beings and so on. So a group of Dutch intellectuals decided to publish a little book with different opinions about the Nuremberg laws and what the German authorities were doing regarding the Jewish people. Only in that booklet there were only 2 Catholics. One was Henry Pauls, who was a famous social activist. Actually, he came from the field of Bible. He was a Bible scholar, but his opinions were a little bit modernist or something like that. He went to the States, he had problems there, he came back to Holland, and he said, okay, forget about the Bible, and I will be chaplain for the miners and for the workers. And he became a very strong workers' defender and so on. And the second one was Titus Brandsma. The thought of Brandsma, the argument of Brandsma was very simple. The title of his collaboration was The Delusion of Weakness. Some people say in English-speaking countries, but I wouldn't be able to say what is the best, that it could be better to translate it for the fallacy of weakness, you know, the fake of weakness. Because the argument, that the logical idea of Titus was, okay, you, National Socialist, you think you are Übermenschen, supermen, humans, superior humans, or something like that. And the Jewish are Untermenschen, you know, inferior human beings. So if they are inferior, why are you so afraid of them? Why are you publishing all these stupid laws and terrible laws against the Jewish population? Why are you so afraid? That's why the title is the delusion or the fallacy of weakness. Or perhaps you are afraid because they are not inferior and they have produced and they have given to humanity so many painters and intellectuals and philosophers and so on. So that's why what you are doing now is the fallacy, is the delusion of weakness. He finished his little article with a very strong sentence that was not, the German newspapers were not very happy about it. The last sentence of his writing was, the way that the Jews are suppressed currently is an act of cowardice. Is an act of cowardice. So a very strong sentence about the Nuremberg laws. And he was criticized very much in some Nazis newspaper and so on. He was signed already in some black lists and so on. The third, how is our time, Michael? Let me know if I have my... How much? Okay. If you see I am too enthusiastic, make me a little sign or... Okay. The third moment is a talk he gave to the students of different universities. Titus was very popular among students. He was always very open to listen their problems, to be close to the students. And I've been in 4 universities in my life, and I think the nicest remembrances I have of them is the teachers, the professors who were able to take a coffee with you or just to say hello, how are you, or to remember your name or something like that, you know. And Titus was one of those. And that's why he was invited many times to a sort of graduation parties that they had when they finished the studies. And there are some funny photographs in which all the students are with funny hats and so on, and Titus is giving a speech to them, and very, very nice situation. And he repeated the same speech in different universities, Groningen, Tilburg, Nijmegen, Rotterdam. And the title of the speech was Heroism. Heroism. And he said to the students, you have finished your studies, you are going now to work, you are going to be important in society, you will be mature and adult men and women, so you have to be heroes. but not in the sense that some perverse ideologies are proposing to you. Not to be heroes of strength, heroes of domination, heroes of nation, race, folk, the people, but to be heroes of other values: honesty, integrity, generosity, forgiveness, and solidarity. That's the heroism you have to develop in your future life. So, without mentioning National Socialism, that speech was clearly addressed to the National Socialist philosophy. Okay, the fourth moment, and you will be very surprised about this, it was a conference he gave about the inclusion of animal protection in the Catholic schools. In that conference, he was speaking about abuse of animals and treating badly animals and making them suffering without any need and so on. So in a way, and I have said that many times, he was also a pioneer in this field of animalism that now is so present in our society nowadays. And so he was trying to avoid cruelty, and he thought it was good in the curriculum of the schools to teach the children also how to behave and how to deal with animals, you know, without cruelty and without abuse and so on. But the background of this conference is much more complicated, much more complicated. In 1933 and 34, the Nazis government in Germany published the very first law all over the world of animal protection. And that law was active till 1972. This is amazing. Nazis were very keen on animals for several reasons. For instance, because they wanted to go back to the divination of nature. So don't celebrate Easter or Pentecost on those stupid Jewish Christian feasts. Celebrate, I think I will be able to say this in English, equinoxes and solstices. Celebrate that. It's not Christmas, it's the solstice of winter, you know, and animals and so on. So they had that idea of nature that had been devaluated by the Jewish Christian society. Actually, Hitler is if you go to internet, it's very easy to find photographs of Hitler with little deers, with little dogs, with his famous doggy and so on, and very tender with animals. So Nazism had a very narrow, very close relationship with animalism and so on. But those laws were also against the Jewish ritual of kosher food. The message was, look at the Jewish. They are cruel with people and they are cruel with animals. This cruel ritual of taking the blood of the animals, of the lambs and so on, and that was forbidden. So there was also a very clear intentionality in the German law of animal protection. And in that context, we understand very much better the speech of Titus Brandsma. It's a sort of moderate animalism, very classical, following St. Thomas Aquinas. You know, we have to be respectful with animals. Even Titus says the commandment of love is not only about human beings, it's also with the creation, because the whole creation is interconnected. Probably you remember Laudato Si. This is an idea that Pope Francis has repeated several times in Laudato Si. Every being is interconnected. So if we are destroying nature here, the whole world is suffering. So that's true, but at the same time, we cannot put the animals in the place of human beings, you know. So animals are in relationship with human beings. And he repeats several times, we have to treat them well. He was not a sort of a fanatic animalist, but he was a moderate animalist. And one of the reasons was that he was confronting this idea of National Socialism. I'm going to give you an example. And I'm not defending bullfighting. I'm going to don't think that I'm defending bullfighting. No. Himmler visited Spain in 1941. The Spanish Civil War was from 36 to 39, so Franco was in power, and they invited Himmler. And they took him. Madrid was destroyed, and the whole country was destroyed for the Civil War, but they took him to a bullfighting spectacle. And Himmler, who was already planning the gas chambers and the Zyklon B and so on, got out after 15 minutes saying, "What a terrible spectacle," and he wanted to vomit and so on. "This is terrible, and how are you able to treat the animals in that way?" I'm not saying he was right or not, I'm not saying that, but that man was the very same man who was preparing the gas chambers and the annihilation camps and so on. It's strange, this mix. So Titus was trying to center the question. You know, we have to respect animals and we have to love them, but not to make an idol of nature and animals and so on. He was trying to center philosophically and theologically the question of animals. The fifth one, and I'm going to finish in a few minutes, is the refusal that Titus expressed to the laws of the occupation government in Holland. For instance, he refused to expel the Jewish pupils of the Carmelite schools. The government, the Minister of Education was pushing, you have to expel the Jewish. What are they doing in a Catholic school? What are they doing in a Christian school? They have to look their own schools. So expel them. So Titus wrote a very famous letter saying that the church in the ministry cannot make distinctions of race, sex, color, and nationality, and so on. And he was trying to play with the government. He was very cunning, I have to say that. He was very clever. And he asked that the children, Jewish children that were studying in our schools before the invasion could remain, and after that he was hiding the others, so the Jewish children were not expelled at the end of the day. They were expelled in 1942 when they were closed, all the schools in Holland, because of the war. And he also refused, and that was the reason why, the concrete reason why he was arrested, he refused to publish the Nazis' propaganda in the Catholic newspapers. That was also a law that every newspaper had to publish the propaganda of the so-called NSB. When Titus speaks about National Socialism, many times he's not speaking about the German National Socialism, but the Dutch National Socialism. The NSB was a very strong party during the war. Before the war was not so popular, but during the war is the National Socialist Beweging, the National Socialist movement in Holland. And during the war they got more than 100,000 people affiliated to the party. And the leader, Anton Adrian Mussert, was imitating Hitler, and they had the same paraphernalia and the same celebrations and national music and all that. So Titus, in the name of the Dutch bishops, was visiting all the editors of the newspapers, saying to them, you cannot publish the propaganda of the National Socialism. And if you do it, the bishop will publish that you are no longer a Catholic newspaper. I would like to say that the Dutch bishops were very strong against National Socialism, very strong. They excommunicated people who were affiliated to the NSB. It was the strongest bishop group in Europe about National Socialism. They were very, very courageous in that sense. So Titus visited them, and it was a not nice work, because many of them were lay people with children and families, and he was asking them to refuse the norms of the government. So it was not an easy job. Nevertheless, he was very happy because most of them said, we are going to resist, and Titus was very, very happy. The provincial said to him, you are in danger, why don't you go to a rural friary and hide a little bit? And Titus said, well, that would be a big shame for me. I am asking these lay editors to resist, and I will hide myself. So that would be a shame for me. So some days before, he was arrested in Nijmegen, and he went to Scheveningen, that's a neighborhood in The Hague, and there he wrote several things, a wonderful poem and some letters. A life of Teresa of Avila without any bibliography, that was his dream, and so he was writing a biography, spiritual biography of Teresa of Avila. I used to say that the cell in which he lived was a terrible place, because some people think he was there alone and writing poems and so on, but it was a terrible place, humid, cold. He could hear how other prisoners were killed, and so a terrible, terrible place. From there, from Scheveningen, he went to Amersfoort, still in Holland, and that was the dark night of Titus. That was the place where he saw there is no solution, he was very weak and so on. From Amersfoort, he went back to Scheveningen, and he was interrogated by Sergeant Hardegen, who was a very elegant fellow and treated him very well apparently and so on. And Hardegen said to him, please write why Dutch people, especially Catholics, are against National Socialism. And Titus wrote a little essay of 8 pages in which he explains the philosophical and theological reasons why they were against the NSB. And in that writing, he finishes with a blessing. I think Michael said that before. When he explains all the reasons and so on, at the end he says, God bless Germany, God bless Holland, may these two great peoples walk again together in freedom and justice. So it's a very nice blessing. I think practically is the last writing of Titus Brandsma. From there he was sent to Kleve or Kleve, that's already in Germany, and from there he was taken to Dachau, where he lived only 6 weeks after he died after some medical experiments. Probably you know that in Dachau there were many experiments with human beings, and he was already very weak, and so he didn't resist, and he died the 26th of July 1942. And 2 curiosities. One is that that day, 26th July 1942, the very same day, that was a Sunday, in all the Catholic churches and some Protestant, was read a letter of the Dutch bishops, a very strong letter against the policy of the occupation government with the Jewish population. And the Nazis authorities were so angry because they didn't stop that. They didn't know the letter before it was read, that they took the measure of taking to jail all the religious with Jewish background. And one of those was Edith Stein and her sister Rose, and they were taken to Auschwitz, where they died probably the 9th August 1942. So the 26th July is a wonderful link between the 2 greatest Carmelites of the 20th century, Titus Brandsma and Edith Stein. And the second anecdote, and I finish with this, is that the Queen, I don't know how do you pronounce the name in English, is Wilhelmina or something like that, Wilhelmina. When she went back to Holland, she heard about Titus Brandsma and so on, and she sent a nice message to the family, saying he was a real patriot, and he was able to fight against this perverse ideology till the very last moment of his life, and that came from a very strong spiritual spiritual richness that he had inside himself. So it's a very wonderful message of the Queen. So this is more or less the summary of this confrontation, this conflict, and I think the witness of this man and many others, of course. There were, imagine that in Dachau there were something like 1,800 priests and even 2 bishops and different religious orders, and especially Polish, many Polish died there. And you all know the witness of Cardinal Faulhaber and von Galen, and Protestants, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Niemöller, and so on. So many prophets that were able to give light in moments of darkness. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We don't have any time for questions. Is that okay?
Oh, questions?
No questions.
Ah, no questions. Okay.
Can I have the microphone?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. I think that was an absolutely riveting presentation to us of Saint Titus Brandsma. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions tonight. If you could just bear with me for a moment. My name is Fáinne Ryan. I'm neither a Jesuit nor a Carmelite, but I am a theologian. And the Loyola Institute was set up for the education of people in the discipline of theology, a discipline that is so needed in our world today. I think as you listen to what Titus Brandsma said and did by his life, he was formed in a theological tradition. You've got leaflets and information about what we do at the Loyola Institute. The next public event we'll be holding will be a series of lectures on true and false reform in the church, based around a very wonderful book by Yves Conger. We'd invite you to think about coming. We're doing it in preparation or in the light of synodality, the whole synodality process. What is going on there? And I was delighted to see that in the first principle of synodality that came from the European meeting was the need for theological formation of the people into the practices of synodality. So the need for theology, I think, was very explicit tonight. So I'd invite you to consider coming to those lectures and also maybe studying theology. You'll get the information on the leaflets. So although you may not become a Jesuit or a Carmelite, you can become a theologian, or you can become a very active participant in the future of the church. And I think Titus Brandsma, some of the things you said there, he was clear. He was a member of the Church of the People of God. So I'm sorry we don't have time for questions, but we have to be out of this building by 9 o'clock. So I'd ask you to exit in a moment. But before we go, I think we need to say one more thanks to Father Fernando tonight for an excellent lecture, an introduction to the life of Titus. And I think he said an awful lot of very interesting things tonight. But what stayed with me is, and I think it's particularly pertinent in our world today, peace is possible. God bless Ukraine, and God bless Russia. And I think that is the message. A saint challenges us. And I think Titus Brandsma, we have been informed and challenged tonight. So thank you very much, Fernando.